Hello, my name is Geraldine O'Neill and I work in UCD Teaching and Learning in University College Dublin. And this research is about empowering students in the assessment and feedback of work integrated learning. It's about the key stakeholders' views. The research was part of a National Forum Teaching and Learning Research Fellowship. So, empowering students in the assessment. What's it all about? What's the context? Well, there's a growing trend internationally to support students in their readiness for employment and life beyond academia. And as a result of this in higher education, there's been a huge growth in work placements and certainly on-campus project and problem-based learning types of opportunities that link with work. So these together are often called work integrated learning, just the terminology. So these project types of experiences as well as placements. But why should we empower students in this context? Why empower them in work integrated learning, WIL? Well, many of the traditional forms of assessment don't often align well with the sort of diversity of placements, the diversity of tasks that students have to do, and the unique skills and knowledge that each student brings to the situation. Also, there are multiple stakeholders in assessment. There's higher education staff sometimes, work placement staff, practitioners, and then centrally is the students in assessment. So by empowering students, we can support more valid and more authentic learning in these different diverse contexts and tasks. Empowerment can really help. So there's a couple of authors that have talked about empowerment in assessment. This one in particular is Francis in 2008's definition. And he talks about the ability of individuals to make personal decisions related to how they're assessed. So the individual student making personal decisions, but also the students as a group, the student cohort making decisions on how they will be assessed themselves. So the empowerment of the cohort of students, so individual and student cohort. And we'll come back to this as we look at sort of ideas around empowerment. So the overall question, was part of a wider study that I was doing on the challenges and solutions to consistency and authenticity in this space. But this paper will particularly look at challenges and solutions to student empowerment in assessment. So both challenges and some solutions. But what do we mean by assessment? Assessment is not just the graded piece of assessment, that's assessment of learning in the green circle here. That demonstrates achievements, often called summative, but I'm also was looking at assessment for learning, which is giving feedback, this purple here at the bottom, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning, which is this idea of students judging, assessing their own work. So this is an idea that they would be able to self-assess themselves. So this is the working kind of definition of assessment for this talk. So it was part of a research. So the methodology I used was participatory research and action. I started off doing some interviews of expert authors who've written about this. So about 7 expert authors. And then I looked at 9 different solution-focused workshops. So it's a qualitative approach. I worked with 2 disciplines in workshops that were on campus using the project problem-based learning type approaches, civil engineering and diagnostic radiography, 3-hour workshops with the educators, students and practitioners in all of them. Then on placement, but maybe assessed by the educator type of context was hospitality, survey construction management, teacher education, business information and systems. And then on placement types of disciplines that were assessed by the practitioner were occupational therapy, veterinary nursing, and physiotherapy. And I used a methodology that looked at exploring lots of dialogue to explore challenges and solutions in each of these workshops. So quite comprehensive hours put into sort of looking at these disciplines kind of ideas for moving forward. Just in relation to the data, there was quite a lot of data generated from these workshops, 27 challenges, 308 solutions, 129 actions. And then from the interviews, there was about 374 codes of data. So lots of data. Thematic analysis was done, Braun and Clark, and you can look at the reference there if you're interested in the methodology. And then 6 key themes came up, of which I'm just particularly focusing on the student empowerment. So that's the methodology. And you can have a little look at the reference there if you want to find out a little bit more about that. So what were the ideas for empowerment in this context? Some of the key challenges, first of all, that the staff and students mentioned were students' readiness and staff's readiness for empowerment. They sometimes didn't feel they were able for it or ready for it. It was a challenge that they mentioned. Students' confidence, the confidence to actually make decisions and actually have some control in how they were assessed, as I say, in those three different types of assessment. The lack of training and education was a challenge. The lack of flexibility in assessment, they were often very fixed. The rigid set of competencies didn't allow any kind of student wiggle room for sort of what competencies they might be assessed against. Irrelevant competencies was mentioned, that they were not meaningful. Lack of control over feedback was a challenge. Feedback too late for action was a challenge, and irrelevant feedback, less specificity, was a challenge. So these were some of the key challenges. So what did they say in relation to solutions? Well, taking the idea that empowerment can be both for the individual student, whether maybe on placement or in that learning opportunity, or with the group, starting with the ideas around the individual student. Some ideas that these participants suggested were that students could start to judge their own performance. So getting the students to be involved in assessing kind of how they're doing themselves. And some of the examples that people mentioned were self-assessment, the students getting a better understanding of the expectations and standards so they could judge their own performance a bit better, important skill. Possibly a choice of assessment method. So what could they do, have some level of control of how they showed that what they were doing well. And one example of this was, could they use video diaries instead of reports? Maybe they might show how they do better through a video diary in a context where reports were used in that type of assessment. Some flexibility in the assessment task, the tasks that they were actually assessed against. And these were often methods such as portfolios and learning contracts certainly allowed more flexibility in what the students were assessed against. Choice and feedback method and tasks. So could they get some level of choice in how they got and received feedback? Again, maybe the use of self-assessment is outperforming feedback, but also maybe peer feedback and audio feedback, different types of feedback, some level of control and power in that. And finally, the students and the staff mentioned the co-creation of tasks and criteria, so that maybe students could be involved in the co-creation of the tasks that they were assessed against. In one example of the criteria piece is that maybe the students could be involved in the creation of some rubrics that might be able to be assessed against. So they're beginning to be more involved in how, when, and where, and what they are assessed and getting feedback on. Some quotes that supported some of these ideas. From hospitality, one suggestion was give students the options of how to submit assessment, report, video interviews, or a mix of these, some choice. That's from the hospitality workshop. Students to continue to monitor their performance in relation to the competency form was a quote from the occupational therapy discipline group workshop. And civil engineering mentioned they could ask students to identify what issue they would like feedback on and request that. So that was from the civil engineering discipline. So on next to the student solutions for the student cohort. Some of the suggestions here were supporting the student cohort. It's really pre-planning and designing for the wider group. So staff are involved very much in designing or planning for these types of ideas. So supporting readiness for empowerment. How do you support students to be ready for this empowerment? And some examples include, maybe lots of inter-stakeholder dialogue, getting everybody into the room, scaffolding the approach. So maybe in the early years of their placements that they more empowered, less empowered at the beginning and more empowered towards the end, or even within a placement that they might be, this is scaffolded throughout. Develop flexible standards and criteria as for the cohort, again, developing this idea of the use of rubrics that could be used in different contexts and in different ways. Allow time for meaningful feedback. So planning in some timetabling time for feedback throughout the module, the process, and early feedback. So idea of getting early feedback, planning for that. The interpretation of context-specific outcomes. This was where in different types of situations, different types of placements, different types of projects, maybe there's some ways that could be interpreted differently. So this is go back to the idea of being irrelevant. That could be in different ideas of how they might be interpreted in different places. So maybe each site, each placement had some specific learning needs and some specific learning requirements. And then the professional development of practitioners for the people out working in the sort of the placement context, they need definitely more ongoing training and support in this, in how to empower. So some quotes here. The importance of dialogue was mentioned in the teaching discipline workshop. Exploring flexible competencies based on assessment, which includes soft and hard skills, survey and construction, mentioned that one. One of the expert authors talked about scaffolding. So to start, we could allocate maybe 20-30% of the mark for the learning contract, but the learning contract become more complex as you go forward. This idea of scaffolding is empowerment. And to develop training opportunities for industry supervisors was the business information systems mentioned this. So this goes back to the idea of more support and training. So some of the policy and practice implications for some of these findings. Bates et al. Talk a lot between the tension between standardization, this idea of standardization, that things need to be standard and to be fair, they need to be standard, and we have standards to keep in these types of learning opportunities. But the contextual variability is so different. How do we have fair standards and meaningful standards? So this balance, there's a really tension here. We need to try and get the best balance between these. Bates's work also talked about more holistic types of assessment in disciplines such as medical education. And what they meant by holistic was lots of different opportunities and lots of different ways that this could be represented. Some of the policy implications also is that maybe there's a need for more capability-based approach. And this is where there are broader kind of outcomes, more holistic outcomes that go across a broader range of contexts. It's often called principles-based standards, which are written at a level that might be slightly wordier and slightly vaguer, but more transferable. There's a critique of more rule-based standards that are very easily measured, but not relevant across contexts. Go back to this contextual variability. And finally, I suppose institutional policies should support resourcing and recognition of staff and student training. This more needs to be done in this place to support staff and students in how to go about being empowered. So finally, in summary, I hope I have presented some ideas for you to support both individual students while they're on this journey, maybe student cohorts, and also how students might actually help the student on their journey to more empowerment. So I hope you found that useful. Just to acknowledge the participants in the study, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, who supported the fellowship project. And here are some of the references and bibliography that have been used in this talk. Thank you for that.